Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We're delighted to have this podcast today with a most wonderful, young, accomplished, very competent woman of faith leader. Stephanie MacGillivray works in Caritas Internationalis. We're going to ask her to tell us a few things about herself, her journey, her organization um, very shortly. But I just wanted to remind folks that Lead Integrity is focused on leading with integrity, on the integrity of leadership, and particularly faith inspired, although obviously not limited to, but certainly we want to understand the extent to which being inspired by faith adds a dimension or several dimensions to leadership, to expectations of leadership, to the journey of life, and to the wisdom that gets accrued and acquired over many years. We're delighted that Stephanie has agreed to speak with us. Those of you who are familiar with the podcast series know that we enjoy the opportunity to learn from all kinds of age groups, all kinds of disciplines, all kinds of professional engagements, and from all over the world. So, without further ado, Stephanie, tell us a little bit about yourself, the journey that brought you here, why you do the work you do. What is the work that you do? Over to you, please.
Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this podcast. It's an honor. And I so admire the work and the mission of Lead Integrity. So thank you. Yes, so my name is Stephanie MacGillivray, and I currently work at CARITAS Internationalis, which is a global confederation of 162 member organizations, which are active in over 200 countries and territories all across our world. We are a Catholic organization, and we have a mission which is inspired by our Catholic values and principles, but we serve everybody. And this is a very important aspect of our mission, is that we are Catholic in the universal sense as well, that we work with absolutely everybody. Our mission is to serve people who are experiencing poverty, marginalization, and vulnerability in their many forms. And we work with obviously our own organizations, but also with external partners as well, which in today's world is very more important than ever, I would say, actually. In terms of my work and my journey, my work here, I have two responsibilities. The first one is all around women and women's empowerment, women in leadership, women's participation in decision making, both within Caritas organizations, so working internally with our own confederation, but also in terms of the communities we serve, acknowledging that women experience poverty in particular forms. Women are often victims in conflict in different ways. And also when, due to climate change or natural disasters, women and children are often actually worse off afterwards. And so we look through that lens of how can we understand women's experience and what do women need as well across the world, and particularly women in those extremely challenging situations. My other responsibility is everything to do with our identity and mission. So essentially, what does it mean to be a Catholic organization? How does our faith-based nature inspire our work, and how do we make that known and understood as well across our confederation? So I lead our work on partnership, ensuring that our Catholic identity is understood, but also that we are operating in a way which reflects our principles and values, and that we are putting those principles into practice. That we are indeed behaving and working with integrity and true to our principles. So that's my other area of responsibility. And indeed, I think that they might seem a little different, but actually there's a huge amount of overlap because in the end, whenever I talk to people who say, "Oh, what are you doing on women?" and I say, "Well, actually, it's a core part of our equality, is a core part of our Catholic identity. You know, God created us equal in His image, and so this is for me the two marry perfectly, actually."
So tell us a little bit more about why you think there may be a misrepresentation on the part of a number of different, especially women and human rights activists who are coming from a more secular orientation, obviously human rights centric space, who believe that um, you can't really marry the gender equality and women's empowerment agendas, and they are obviously distinct agendas, they're not one and the same, but you can't somehow have that addressed from a religious or a faith perspective, because they see a tension or a almost an opposition between what religions have to say and what gender equality, women's empowerment demand. And they seem to think this is a direct contradiction, because, and this is particularly relevant for the understanding of my faith, Muslim faith or Islam. It's also relevant with the from the understanding of a Catholic perspective. So tell us a little bit about why you think there is that perception, and have you encountered it in your work at all, and how do you deal with it?
Thank you. Yeah, it's an important question, and I think one that we grapple with regularly. To be honest with you, I think that there is this sense of separation or incompatibility, largely due to uh, lack of understanding on both sides of the other.
Hmm.
And I think that one of the things which I think is a great shame at the moment in the kind of in the world that we live in, especially the conversations which take place, online a lot, are that people sort of choose a camp and they don't actually engage properly with the other or in a way which is really genuine. And I think what we're missing is that genuine curiosity about the other in a way that is non-judgmental
Hmm.
and says, I know what my principles or values or beliefs are, but I can listen to someone and hear someone who may have a different opinion on a particular topic or issue, but actually we might have some common ground as well. And I think that we just sadly put up these sort of invisible walls and sort of tend to stick to our own side, partly because it's become so easy to attack as well. And so I think obviously nobody likes to be attacked. And so instead of saying, okay, I can engage with this, um, people just tend to sort of lock themselves in and not engage. I also think that there is a bit of a tendency to say, I'm right, you're wrong, that's it, especially when it comes to issues of ethics or moral issues as well. Um, and I think that, the in our extremely, our world of pluralism and many different cultures and beliefs and politics. I think that we've lost that sense of really engaging with the other. When I come across this, and I do, I tend to really say, why don't we just have a conversation? Or try to also, the thing is, we all know there are some things that we will just disagree on. Um, but so why do we need to focus on that? My attitude is very much, we know what we disagree on, but we don't actually know what we agree on.
Hmm.
And so why don't we try to be curious in that side and say, oh, actually, what are you doing in terms of, encouraging women to take part in local politics? Or what are you doing in terms of, ensuring that that women have access to finances, etc. And so there's a lot of territory which is really fertile for collaboration, but which goes unexplored because of other issues which are perhaps just one or two, but actually have the loudest voice.
Hmm.
And I think it's about trying to tone down our sort of our voices, I suppose, when we're talking to have more civil conversations. I think it's the sort of the tone of public discourse needs a bit of a recalibration, in my opinion. Um, but I think that if we're able to, and then this always leads to fruitful conversations. I mean, we've done events or projects or partnerships with organizations that we disagree with on many things, but actually we managed to find some really fruitful ground for collaboration. For example, on areas where you say, okay, what are you doing about, for example, one of the strongest topics I can think of right now is when we engage in things to do with conflict-related sexual violence, for example. This is something which many, many organizations are working on in different ways, and we all have something to offer. But if we're not having those conversations, we don't know. And we can't, I do believe that we are much stronger when we work together and in coordination and collaboration.
Brilliant. So, on that note, I think it, mm, there are several things that you said that raise questions. So maybe what we could do is ask you to start to speak of one particular example of such collaboration where your organization worked with other organizations, perhaps on the issue of sexual violence and conflict or any other issues that they were not all Catholic organizations, they were not even religious organizations. Maybe give us an example of one such initiative so that folks who are listening get to see, how and what that looks like and how did the working relationship work out? What did you guys do together, etc.?
Absolutely, yeah. So, a clear example I can tell you is so here I should say Caritas Internationalis is the sort of the general secretariat of the entire Caritas Confederation, and we're based in Rome, and we're linked to the Vatican, to the Holy See. Um, uh, Also based in Rome are many embassies to the Holy See, governments which are have representation here. And so, for example, one event that we were invited, piece of work then that we were invited to collaborate in was the signing of the Declaration of Humanity with the British Embassy to the Holy See. And now, the British government has very clear policies on women's empowerment and what that means. And we have differing policies. And there is always a bit of a question of what does this entail? Can we work with each other? And we find that we have a lot of common ground. And actually, we collaborated and had there was a sort of a conference and a sort of signing ceremony, I suppose, of this Declaration of Humanity, which is about combating conflict-related sexual violence, with all of the issues and stigma that goes with conflict-related sexual violence. And we were able to share some really great work that we're doing, for example, in Tigray, in Ethiopia, and on this. And what we have really found, for example, working with embassies based here, we do quite a bit of collaboration with embassies, and they really appreciate the sort of the concrete nature of the work of Caritas. And this is where I found the most fruitful collaborations, where it's not necessarily actually organizations which are doing the same kind of work. We have the same end goal, which is to end conflict-related sexual violence. But we're doing our thing, they're doing their thing, and we've collaborated to raise awareness, to share the information, which will then inform each other on both sides. And everyone really appreciated the collaboration, which went very well. And yeah, as I say, I think that we can show that we're providing concrete help on the ground to people who need it. And that's where they see, oh, you're a Catholic organization, but we didn't even know that you were doing that. And I think sometimes I sometimes say here, we don't say enough about what we do. And it's not about boasting or being proud in a negative sense. It's about saying, we're here, we can offer this.
It's interesting that you brought that up because indeed, one of the many challenges of faith inspired work in general, not just within the Catholic domain or anywhere other religion, but generally across the board, is especially in areas where women are doing the work and the bulk of the work on any specific issue. And of course, 90% of service providers, those doing work in religious spaces and religious institutions, religious NGOs, are women. So they carry a lot. But one of the biggest challenges is that they will rarely ever be comfortable to speak about their work, precisely because this notion of, first of all, it's a duty. This is what, we believe our faith tells us or demands from us to do, is to serve in this particular way or to serve in general. But second, also because of this fear of appearing to be boastful, to have any pride. And, so this kind of goes against the grain of doing the work, even though it is needed. You do need to be able to talk up what you do, to speak about what you do, precisely because if you don't, there's a wide area of gray ignorance about the work of religious organizations on some of these issues that should be acknowledged, should be understood, exactly along the lines that you said. So the question that comes to my mind is, you said the collaboration with the embassies is very good. It's ongoing, and it helped to allow you as an organization to show the very concrete efforts you do. And indeed, religious organizations are the most concrete in terms of the services that they do, the most concrete historically. Long before we had ministries of health and education and sanitation, nutrition, and whatever, we've always had religious institutions and organizations serving people. But why are there examples of your work with secular NGOs? Because as you said, the area of sexual violence in conflict or conflict related sexual violence, that area is indeed rife with many engagements from many non-governmental organizations as well. Does Caritas Internationalis work with or partner with any of these secular NGO counterparts?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to answer that is to say it's not Caritas Internationalis that necessarily partners, but it's our local Caritas, our national Caritas organizations, which are present in countries. We always use the phrasing before, during, and after any crisis or any event or anything. And this is sort of another part of our identity, is that we don't just come in when there's an issue. What we do is we're based in communities, so we understand the needs of that community. So for an example of where we've worked in the past, I wasn't directly involved in this, but I've heard about it from others, is for example, I'm struggling to remember which country it was, but I remember that it was an earthquake. So this is a different thing to CRSV, but just to give you an example of sort of secular collaboration and the way it works. Sorry, yeah, conflict related sexual violence. Sorry, I know I shouldn't use. um, yeah, the way that we do it is often that other organizations, for example, humanitarian organizations who don't necessarily have that grassroots presence all the time will obviously arrive in a country or sort of, mobilize. And what we do is we're already on the scene essentially. And so then we play a key role in working with those organizations to inform about the communities, the needs of the communities, because understanding the local community is often one of the biggest things that I don't want to say divide, but the biggest challenges, I would say. Especially when you're in a community which has a religious identity, whatever that may be. In some of the countries that we work in, I know, for example, that we work in countries which are predominantly Muslim, for example, but we have a very strong CARITAS because we are a trusted and known organization which really understands that community. And so I'm in this situation of this earthquake when it happened. I remember I was told that these sort of secular, the Oxfams and the Save the Children's of this world came in with a plan, and it was a good plan, but it didn't actually address some of the really urgent needs that were there in that community right then. So then in collaboration with the local Caritas, they were able to reassess and actually address some of the most important needs, some of which, might be to do with, as I say, the religious identity of that community or other issues. Indeed, for example, women who may have been affected in particular ways, etc. So it works well. We often also partner in a local country with like other local organizations, not necessarily sort of the big NGOs, but other local organizations which which don't have a religious identity, let's say, which are secular or maybe of another faith. But and that also goes very well because in the end, I think the thing that makes for good collaboration is understanding our shared mission and vision, and what that really means. I think one of the things that hampers it or challenges it is a lack of religious literacy, generally speaking. And I always use the phrase, I say religious literacy has to be part of our toolkit when we're addressing the needs of a community and when we're explaining who we are and what we do, especially when working with secular organizations, because it might seem a bit hard to understand, especially in a world where religion in some parts of the world doesn't play actually that much of a role in people's lives anymore. I'm talking especially, sort of global north type parts of the world. But actually, when you're then a humanitarian worker who knows very little about a particular religion or anything, and you go to a place which then is that is who they are, you need to understand. It's crucial.
True. And I think you've hit on a very good point there, which is that the bulk of the world, with the exception of Western Europe, which is quite tiny in size and population relative to the rest of the world, is actually the rest of the world is very religious. And yet we all operate in the international development, in foreign policy spaces. We all operate with the mindset of the very, very tiny few. And see the world from that very extraordinarily limited perspective. And one of the things missing in that is an understanding of just how much a religious consciousness and religiousness and religious institutions and religious presence matters to over 84% of the world's population.
Yeah.
Great point that you've made. One of the things that strikes me, you gave the example of working, say, with other organizations like Oxfam or whatever, and that partnership helping recalibrate, because the wisdom or the savvy about the religious sensitivities, inclinations that you have as Caritas Internationalis or as Caritas, that wisdom may not be readily available in the same way with other non-religious or non-faith-based humanitarians, development organizations, etc. I'm curious if you have a concrete example of that. And if you don't, it's okay. That comes to you right now. If you don't, it's okay, because I will ask you afterwards to share with us some links to some of the work in which some of these issues are indeed covered. But do you have, at the moment, right now, sorry to spring it on you, an example of how the partnership or the collaboration between Caritas and another organization that's of sort of similar international presence and service has helped deepen the, or at least freshen the religious literacy, the sensibilities of that particular context? Does anything come to mind right now? And like I said, not to worry. I sprung it on you without prior preparation. It's okay. You can always share with us, and I will share with our viewers whatever you shared. But I think it is an important point, because we do say that as faith-inspired and faith-based NGOs, there is a sense of maintaining that there's a wisdom that is an added value in international development, human rights, humanitarian work. There's an added value to being a religious organization, apart from being there always, not having to be brought in and leave, but in fact always being part of the community. That there is that knowledge of how the community thinks when it comes to faith and different religions that perhaps is not immediately apparent or even invested in learning from other organizations, even though cultural sensitivity is something that I think most organizations doing humanitarian international work will have indeed become vested in, because they've had to work and operate. But is cultural sensitivity the same as religious literacy, in your opinion?
Well, to start from that last point, I think it's similar, but it's not the same.
Mm.
And I think that uh, I yeah, it's a really great question. Is cultural sensitivity the same as religious literacy? I think the answer is no, it's not the same.
Mm.
Also because
Mm.
unfortunately, in some cultures,
Yes.
within the culture itself, religion is weaponized
Mm-hmm.
to further uh, social norms which are harmful. And I say this particularly, for example, in the case of, for example, female genital mutilation. At the Commission on the Status of Women this year in New York, I heard some really moving, and I feel moved right now just talking about it, moving statements about female genital mutilation and the way in which religious leaders in communities were misinterpreting and misusing religious texts to defend this. And so that's why I think cultural sensitivity and religious literacy are not the same. It's quite perhaps a strong example, but I think that it's important to note that also because
Wait, before we
going into a
Stephanie,
place,
Stephanie,
yeah,
forgive me for interrupting you, but I think you've made a very, very good point here. And I think the example of female genital mutilation is a very good example to showcase the difference. But can you elaborate on that? So what is it that cultural sensitivity brought in this context, or brings, or is in this context of female genital mutilation, that religious literacy doesn't? Or where do they elaborate that a bit more? I don't think it might be obvious to anyone.
sure. No, thanks. I think that religious literacy means going back to the roots of what is that religion teaching. I think understanding, because religions are based upon teachings, we are taught and we then believe those teachings. And we indeed are meant to not just believe them, but actually enact them as well. And so understanding the teaching, that is what I would call religious literacy. Whereas I think cultural sensitivity I heard examples, for example, of people saying, oh, but we don't want to impose something that's, like as you said, European Western belief, yeah, or even indeed Western European, because not even the whole of Europe. But we don't want to impose, we don't want this is like it's their culture and stuff, but actually harmful behavior is not cultural norms, and accepting harmful behavior is not being sensitive to that culture. It's they're two separate things, and I don't think that. And these aren't, I do believe what I'm saying, but they're not actually my words. These are things that I heard from people from those cultures, saying, actually the perpetuation of such harmful behaviors, all defended by supposedly what that religion is teaching is not true. And so that's where I would make the distinction. I think understanding the teachings, because even within our faith, I think it becomes I don't say this it is critical, but not in a horrible way, that I think people become kind of a bit lazy because it's a bit of effort. And so you sort of get these things which have been passed down, which become stereotypes. And people say, oh, for example, the Catholic Church doesn't do anything for women. Whenever I tell people that I work here linked with the Vatican and I'm doing all this stuff about women's leadership, they're really surprised and say, oh, I didn't realize the Catholic Church would do something like that. And so I said, oh, okay, well, let's have a coffee and I'll tell you about it. And I think that it's about understanding actually the church teaches this. And these are other things which perhaps have been culturally passed down, especially in countries which perhaps are more conservative socially. What is the role of women in that society, etc. And so it's quite easy to confuse the two, but I think we need to be very careful actually about understanding, religions, what religions teach. Another example, a great example I could give is also to do with, domestic abuse, for example. It's something which I work with somebody, and she runs a domestic abuse counseling service, a Catholic a Christian service, and specifically for Christians and Catholics. And she says, "Oh, the women who come to me and say that they went to their priest first, because this is what we have to understand. Religious leaders have so much influence. If you are a devout member of that faith, religious leaders can have a huge impact on you, more than maybe anyone else, because that is what you believe. That is what you found your behavior, your life on." And so this woman said, I went to my priest and he said, "Oh, I must not be loving my husband enough. That maybe I didn't, I should go back. I should try to please him and all this stuff." And this counselor said it actually took this woman about, I think she said it was something like 6 or 7 years before she found proper help and advice, because she said, "Oh, I want to, whatever I do, I want it to be in line with my faith. I don't want to, because she thought getting divorced is against what the church teaches. But actually, if you're a victim of abuse within your marriage, the church says this is perfectly acceptable to leave your marriage. In fact, it is the right thing to do because your safety comes first, because that person is not respecting your human dignity." And so it's another good example where people say, "Oh, but the church teaches that you can't get divorced." But it's not as simple as that. It's not black and white. And there are all these gray areas, but we need to pay attention to them.
I think those two examples capture it very well. And thank you for bringing up actually three examples, because if you consider domestic violence and divorce, where there is this big understanding that the church teaches against divorce, the church teaches against actually your own right not to be injured, and violently abused by even by your spouse. The church definitely has teachings like that. All faiths have teachings about that. But then there's this perception or misperception that these are cultural norms validated by religious teachings, when in fact there's a whole reality. So to distinguish between what is culturally vested, albeit using religious norms, values, and language, versus actually being having a very different understanding of the teachings of the religion, that are articulated by those who are knowledgeable of the religious spaces. But one of the critiques, Stephanie, of this work that you'll hear is, look, we don't all have time to learn about religion. There's that's a specialized field, highly specialized, highly whatever. We can't all be religiously literate and savvy, and the different schools of thought in every religion would make your hair go white overnight just because you're trying to figure them out. And there's plenty. Religion is one of the most contentious areas, and religious discourse is massive. It is bigger than all our scientific discourses put together, so to speak. So the in the pushback often is, who has time to learn about all these different religious things when you have values and international legislation? You have human rights values based on the commonalities of all religious values, and you have international legislation and national legislation that very clearly gives you the right to whatever, all the different rights you're entitled to. So, surely we should be much better versed in what our norms, our international laws and laws themselves tell us, and human rights values, which cover everybody's, all the religions. Surely we should be better versed in that and work with those paradigms than have to, all of us, become more religiously savvy. What would you say to that attitude?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, I've encountered it myself as well. It's funny you should say about putting more gray hairs on your head, because in fact, the other day I saw a bishop that I used to work with in England when I worked with the bishops there before I came here. I came here 4 years ago, and I hadn't seen him for well over maybe 6 years now because of the pandemic. And he said, "Oh, yeah, no, because I said, oh, don't know if you remember me." And he said, "Yeah, no, of course I remember you and I recognized you. I see you've got a few more gray hairs though." So I said, "Thank you." So
Very
it even happens to us.
felt,
Um,
felt very complimented, I'm sure. Yes, it's,
yeah,
it's
but
helpful.
anyway, to answer your question, when I encounter this kind of thing, I think, of course, it's our responsibility to understand international law and human rights, and this huge gamut of protections really that we have and that we've created as a society. I think it's when I think about it, you I think, wow, actually we've done such a huge amount when it comes to human rights. But then I look back and I also look at the state of the world. And I think, okay, but there are so many, despite this wealth of protection, there are so many human rights violations. And I ask myself, why is that? Clearly, it's the protections are important, but actually, when you are in a local town, a village, or wherever it is, especially in some of the more remote parts of the world, again, I go back to what I was saying before. You need to look at who is the influential leader in that community, because that's the person who should be understanding international human rights law and as well. And I think vice versa, people who are making international law and also advocating for it across the world should look to the grassroots. This can't be a, top to bottom way of working. It has to be a two-way street. Um, in Caritas, for example, we always emphasize this thing about having a local presence, and we really take our lead from the grassroots. And as I said before, the needs of that community. And so, yeah, I think I perhaps it's not a great answer, but I think it's a both and answer rather than either or, because it's clear from the state of the world that we need to understand what's happening on the ground and understand how those laws then apply as well.
Yes, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's a both and. And I think that also makes it clear. In other words, it's both, you need to understand both the laws, the legislation, and what they're based on, the common values and shared commitments from all cultural backgrounds. But you also need to understand the specifics of the local contexts, which includes also the religious teachings and the cultural appropriations of these teachings that have happened over time. So yes, absolutely both and. I guess where we have therefore an argument to make and a very and a very important argument to make is the advocacy for more partnerships, which is why it's important that the religiously inspired, religiously based institutions of service to humanity, which operate at such local, national, regional, and international levels, need to work with others who are also working at these various levels, but may not be, in fact, are not always religiously inspired. So the argument for partnerships becomes even more relevant when you think of the dynamics of religions, impact of religious leaders, local dynamics and local contexts, and the broader impact. So it is important to work together. And we come back to the point you were saying earlier, the examples of partnerships that you have as CARITAS with other actors, whether they are in the secular or spaces, governmental or non-governmental. So I'm going to ask you to share with us a few resources later on so that people can see the work that CARITAS does at the local level. What do you think about the mainstream argument that you've got to, that localization is the way to go, that you have to localize? What's new about that for an organization like Caritas, which has kind of always been pretty much working, and you said you emphasize the local presence. What are your thoughts on some of those arguments about localization as the future, as the this and the that? Share with us a bit, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, it is indeed something that we've been doing for a long time, even without sort of the narrative of the localization agenda. That's not to say that we haven't had our own challenges, that's for sure. And it's difficult. But what I would say is I think the current global political situation means that we're kind of being catapulted into localization. Because, for example, I'll give you like with us how we're thinking. So, for example, the US aid funding cuts have impacted us a lot. And our one of our organizations, which is based in the USA, which received a lot of funding from US aid, has had to cut many, many, many of its staff. I'm talking thousands, who were based all over the world and who had been based all over the world for 20, 30 years, because this is the way that the system had been working. All in theory, empowering the local community. But actually, now that those people aren't there anymore, I hear people saying things like, okay, well, like these projects have to continue. If we stop them, you know, lives will be lost. This is how serious it is. And also how crucial the work of these organizations are. It's when they become sort of part of the community, because their life-saving work isn't necessarily only in response to a huge crisis that's just struck that day. It's because a lot of communities are living in these extended periods of difficulty and crisis. And so the way that people are thinking now is actually, okay, well, it is at the local level that this work must continue. And We in Caritas, we are shifting slightly away from the term localization, and we talk a lot more about local leadership. Um, Also because localization is sort of it implies something that's being done to a local population, whereas local leadership implies that this is something that is actually from the grassroots. And it might seem just a point of language, but actually it changes the perception, especially in that local community, which if I can put it, for example, partnerships among between two Caritas organizations. So is always has always the number one objective is always to strengthen the local Caritas in order that it can become completely autonomous, independent,
Mm,
self-reliant.
mm,
And that is in principle the purpose of partnership. Um, and so now it's that, okay, this we really have to do this now because there is just not the funding available to do otherwise. So partly it's almost like being pushed, but actually it is something that we've been pushing or trying to do ourselves as well for a long time. And this is why when you were saying just before this about the need for more partnerships, I think today that's just crucial because I think previously there was also a case of a lot of duplication of work going on. And actually now that people have to really focus, I think that partnership will be crucial because you can't now have five organizations doing the same thing. We have to really prioritize, and I think the whole sector, the way it works, is truly in a historic moment of change, actually. And I think that this, the as we call it, local leadership and everything will be extremely important, and also feeds, all of this very complex, and I say complex in a good sense that there's a real need to address it seriously. The everything to do with decolonization and everything. This is something which is very deep, and it's not something which is easily solvable, but requires partnership among organizations which are doing it.
well said. You mentioned the the criticality of local leadership, using the language that you have in Caritas, local leadership. And at the same time, before you had also acknowledged the, if you will, the dangers and the challenges of certain understandings of um, religion, culture, etc., that local leaders have that can be extraordinarily harmful to women. So how do you see the two things? And on the one hand, you need to be much more reliant on local leadership now because that's it. It's what that's the fait accompli situation that you've got. You no longer have funding that enables you to diversify and have others do different things, the same things, or but at the same time, you do have situations where some very real harm can be happening and is attributed to local leadership. So how do you see those things working out?
Yeah, it's an important question, and the important thing is to keep making progress, obviously. And the way that in Caritas, for example, we are addressing this is by working on the way that how can I put it? But so we've got a resource which we are actually in the process of finalizing now, which is quite exciting. We're just in the sort of pilot implementation phase of it. Um, and it's called the Caritas Partnership Principles and Modus Operandi. So basically, how do we translate those principles into those partnership principles into action? And this is something which is very important, for example, in our enormous confederation. It's something which unites us in the sense of saying, this is Caritas partnership. And the process for creating this document has been long. It's not didn't start, recently, it's the reiteration of several processes. And I've been involved in it, as I say, for the last 3 years. And it's been intensely participatory across the Confederation. And this is something I think which perhaps speaks to the question you just asked. You have to create a sense of ownership among that for us, among our confederation, which is quite a challenge, I'll tell you that. But actually, we got there through consulting, trying to understand different regional and local perspectives, but always in the sense of with a genuine engagement and genuinely listening, and having this sort of mutual dialogue as well. And I think this is where we can work together with local leaders, because it's not about sort of just saying, okay, here you go, you're on your own. We're working still together, just in a different way. And I think that, creating this sense of ownership, a shared purpose and mission. We have, for example, in our confederation, we have a strategic framework which is confederation wide. Now, each region and each organization has their own, work plan, but this strategic framework is something which globally covers us, and in which it says, for example, one of our strategic objectives is about promoting the leadership and participation of women, and about monitoring and communicating the progress that we make, or the work that is done, let's say. And so, this is something which the entire Confederation is signed up to. And I think that's where one can avoid the issues that you raise. And by continuing this collaboration in a genuine and meaningful way, giving voice to that local leader and the local community, because really it's all, the local community's voice should be the one that we are raising up. And yeah, so I think that sense of sharing in a mission and a goal.
So given that, and you've got the picture there of Pope Francis, God rest his soul, behind you, what what is it about your faith that has driven you to do the work you do? One assumes that you are driven by your faith. If you're not, please correct me. And what kind of wisdom and advice would you give younger and older folks who are in, for different reasons at different moments in their lives, also looking for that kind of a purpose, um, and are already in positions of leadership? What brought you to, what in your faith brought you to where you are today and sustains you? And what wisdom would you give others?
Thank you. Yeah, indeed, I am Catholic, and I was inspired by my faith to do this work. Um, After I did my postgraduate degree at university, and I studied music, so nothing to do with any of this. Supposedly, I do try to weave music in whenever I can, so they weren't wasted years. But no, I joke. But I was very much set for an academic career, and I loved it. Music is, I still say, my first love and my first passion. But I had and have always had a very strong sense of social justice. And I remember, when I was growing up and I would hear certain things and I would think that's not right. And I was born in South Africa, and my parents, we lived there throughout apartheid. And actually, when I heard stories like, for example, my mum, who was a lecturer in Afrikaans at university there, she would illegally, I can think I can say it now and she'll be fine. Anyway, she would um, go into local communities and teach Black workers Afrikaans, which would enable them to communicate and to get a job because that was the official language. Because one way of further separating was to speak a totally different language, which that nobody could understand. And so that was that. And it would also shut them out from any kind of work or anything. So I thought that was like, wow, that's really cool that you did that. And she's a very devout Catholic. All of this to say, I was very driven by this sense of political justice, I would say as well, social justice. But I had always seen, well, I was inspired by the principles of my faith. And, I went to Catholic schools and it was very ingrained in us, this sense of, love your neighbor and be the good Samaritan and things like this. And I just carried it with me somehow. And then as I got to the end of my postgraduate degree and I thought, what am I going to do? This doesn't feel quite right. And I just had this sense that I needed to put my faith into action somehow. And anyway, I found an internship with the bishops in England and Wales, which was called Faith in Politics. And it was about um, getting young graduate Catholics to work in either in politics, literally with members of parliament in parliament, or with public affairs departments in Catholic organizations. So I worked in the Catholic Education Service in their public affairs department. And that's how I found my way in because I saw there was a way to link your faith with achieving something which went far beyond it and which had positive effects for society and was really about social justice. And so the advice, I mean, I would advise everyone, no matter what your age, to always follow your passion, to listen to what's within you and say, what am I really feeling? What really fires me up? Because I think that, a lot of people think, oh, I'll go to work and then, I'll go home and cook dinner and that's that. And it's all a bit kind of not passionate. And I'm not saying you need to be burning with passion every single day in the office. I'm certainly not every single day. But it gives you a sense of purpose and of drive. And this thing about, yeah, listen to your passions and act upon it where possible, even in the smallest way. At university, I started out by volunteering in a soup kitchen, so it doesn't have to be anything huge. You don't have to change someone's life every single day. But listening to your passions, but also I think being curious, listening to other people. I was always really curious about, for example, like what my mum did during apartheid, because I thought, wow, that's crazy that you lived through such a time. Because for us, even it seems unimaginable, even though we see what's happening in the world today and you think maybe not. But I think that listening to those voices, being inspired by others, thinking, oh, what could I do? How could I contribute in some way? Being active, and it doesn't matter how young or old you are, volunteering is not something just for students. And leadership is not just something for seasoned professionals, as you say. I think that being a leader is also about doing something. I think even just action can be a way of showing leadership, and that can be really, really inspiring.
Brilliant and very, very well said. Stephanie MacGillivray. We are delighted and honored to have had this opportunity to listen to you and to, in a sense, harvest some of your wisdom. I think you are a very inspiring person, and I think that the work that you do and the insights that you have are extraordinarily relevant for almost everything that's happening around us today. So I know you are extraordinarily busy, and we're deeply honored and happy to have had this opportunity to be with you. I will ask you to share some, perhaps if you like, some links to some documents. I was taking a couple of photographs on screen as you were talking, so I could use them when we're publicizing this. I hope that's okay. And I look forward very much to seeing how people engage with this podcast once they listen to all this wisdom. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for the time and the wisdom shared.